Law Matters. I'm your host, Jennifer Varsley. Today we'll be speaking with Professor Randall Abate about his new work in the area of climate change. He's looking at how we can better protect our voiceless communities, that is to say, future generations, wildlife, and natural resources. This is a hot topic at the moment, with many people considering that we're not doing good enough as a global society in terms of protecting these communities, let alone protecting our own interests. So what can we do from a legal perspective to really get the job done? Will this involve better international regulation, or perhaps national or even domestic regulation? Or will this involve something that we as global citizens can all do at the grassroots level? It will be great to get Randall's thoughts on this topic and hear some of the challenges as well as the opportunities that present themselves. Hi, Randall. Thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So that you are joining us on a very important topic today. We're looking at climate change and the voiceless. And to begin with, I thought, it would be interesting for our viewers to know who constitutes the voiceless.
So for the purposes of my book project, the voiceless are three categories. Future generations of humans, and that includes current youth and the unborn. Wildlife is the second category, and natural resources are the third. The need for clarification on this in some circles is that the voiceless can also be used to refer to marginalized communities such as minority or immigrant populations. However, those communities aren't the focus of this book project. But the book does recognize that the law's response to becoming more sensitive and seeking to protect those other marginalized communities in the environmental justice movement certainly has helped establish a pathway for potential of the law to protect the voiceless communities, which are the focus of this book project.
Very interesting. And I think some people might be interested to know, well, why do these groups need protection?
Yes, and that refers to the idea that voiceless means lacking a legal voice in our systems of law. And so that inability to represent one's own interests on one's own behalf generates this need for the law to respond in a way where the government ought to do more to keep the interests of these voiceless and marginalized communities in mind. And there's a similar need for rights-based protections for these communities so that they can have legal recourse when their interests are not fully considered.
Oh, very important. And then in terms of the current legal framework, can you explain to us a little bit more about how does that operate?
And that would involve a three-part response since we are dealing with three different communities here. So with respect to future generations, existing law basically does not provide any formal legal protections for the unborn. There are some scholars that call for a recognition of their interest by providing due regard for the unborn in decisions that governmental entities make that have an impact on future generations. With respect to current youth, they certainly do have some rights as humans, but not to the degree that adult humans do. So most significantly, they lack the right to vote, and that is a very significant impediment to their rights being fully protected when we talk about matters like climate change and the need for aggressive regulation to protect their interests in having a sustainable future. So the wildlife category, whether we're talking about animals in the wild or domesticated animals, the law almost in all legal systems treats animals as property. And essentially, if you are property under the law, that means that you have virtually no rights to self-determination. You are used to to advance the interests of the humans that are using you for their gains. So in the U.S. and many other countries, there have been animal rights efforts in the courts, for instance, to apply some degree of legal personhood for wildlife, such that there may be an opportunity for these animals to be freed from captivity and be able to live in sanctuaries that would approximate the conditions of their lives in their natural habitats without being subject to human control. And then on the natural resources domain, similar to wildlife, natural resources are subject to sovereign political control and exploitation at all times. And there has been a movement known as the Rights of Nature movement that has sought to address this status quo that is very much to the detriment of natural resources, pushing them to the brink of exploitation and likewise extinction for animals. And there have been some very significant developments where natural resources like rivers have been bestowed with legal personhood in countries like New Zealand, India, Colombia, and there are human guardians appointed to represent the interests of those rivers that have been recognized as having intrinsic value and the right to be protected.
And I think, some people might argue, particularly those that think, oh, well, we don't need to change our laws to protect these groups. Some people might say, are the voiceless not beneficiaries of our current laws? That is to say, if we do a good job at environmental protection, won't everyone benefit? Perhaps you might speak to that point.
Yes, I think there's, by and large, the voiceless are not beneficiaries of our current laws. Certainly to many, in many regards, the laws don't go far enough if they do have some level of protection for these communities. So ultimately, the climate change is a good example of this reality. When you think about, based on what the science is telling us from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the degree of legal response and regulation that's needed to address climate change effectively is something we are not nearly achieving on a global basis. And so our laws are essentially very short-term economic gain focused and don't fully consider the future generations' interests of a future that is 3-4 decades away, and ultimately would be a very unsustainable future without these more aggressive climate change regulatory efforts that need to occur but are not occurring because the laws are enacted by adult humans that don't feel that sense of urgency because they won't be alive for that climate catastrophe that awaits the future generations.
And so in that case, how might we better protect the voiceless given those challenges you've raised?
And the book devotes a significant amount of time to this issue. And so with the three different categories in mind, future generations commissions would be one legal mechanism that would be very effective in addressing the interests of the voiceless, of current youth and the unborn. Essentially, these commissions already exist in several countries: Germany, Switzerland, Hungary, Wales. And the goal of these commissions is essentially to represent the interests of future generations, either in legislative or judicial proceedings. And there's an ample precedent for this type of representation throughout legal systems around the world. For instance, in the U.S., in divorce custody proceedings, there are court-appointed guardians to represent the interest of young children in terms of which parent is going to be better suited to have custody over that child. The child at age 3 is not making those decisions on her or his behalf. So when it comes to the wildlife dimension, the legal system is very much in the throes of seeking legal personhood for different contexts of wildlife. Many of these cases do involve wild animals, some do involve domestic animals, but the driving force here is that the current protection of animals is almost exclusively humans needing to be injured and have some reason to protect animals as the way the legal system enables animal protection. And what legal personhood is seeking to establish is having recognition of the animal's intrinsic value such that humans could then be the mouthpiece for protecting that intrinsic value, as opposed to only being able to sue for when harm to animals is harmful to humans. And then finally, the book devotes a significant amount of time to the notion that sustainable development is something that would benefit all three categories of the voiceless if we are able to recognize it as a binding legal mandate rather than mere aspirational rhetoric. So sustainable development as a principle has been around for 3 or 4 decades, But ultimately, even to this day, it's very much lip service about how we should think about our decisions, but rarely amounts to a binding mandate that if something is deemed unsustainable, it shall not happen. And there's very promising precedent that is now occurring in the courts around the world. One recent decision in Australia is a very good representation of this thinking. And there, a major coal mine project was rejected, was not allowed to proceed because the court in that decision ultimately determined that allowing that mine project to go forward would cause the country to exceed its its carbon budget for that year, for that country. And ultimately, science can give us those standards about what is sustainable and what isn't. And that's the notion of sustainable development becoming a binding legal mandate rather than a mere aspirational principle.
Okay, very interesting. And then, so do you see that moving forward at the international level or at the national level? Like you gave some examples, for example, Australia, or both?
Yeah, that would absolutely need to happen at all levels of governance. This is such a challenging problem when we're talking about protecting the voiceless communities in the era of climate change. We're talking about levels of governance from the international to the regional to the national to the state and local. There are all a variety of ways in which these kinds of standards and governance can occur at all those levels of governance.
And then it will eventually, the hope is that these standards will become legally binding, as you say.
Correct. So that could be in the form of legislation, and that could be through the judicial system on a case-by-case basis. So, for instance, in the U.S., we have standards that have taken decades to be really cohesive in terms of what they really mean. So in determining whether a woman's right to choose is being infringed upon by a state, a piece of legislation, we apply the undue burden standard. And that isn't self-evident what it means for a law to impose an undue burden on a woman's right to choose, but that evolved over time through jurisprudence, the court decisions on that. And similarly, sustainable development is an inherently amorphous kind of term, but the science behind what sustainable means could ultimately guide standards that would become more cohesive and transparent.
Oh, that's good to know. So we can still feel positive about it, that even though these things aren't happening overnight, over time, what we can see, as you mentioned, is that this move towards almost, I guess, legal enforceability, would you say, or having that place within a legal binding, whether it's statute or through courts, as you mentioned.
I think that's right, and ultimately it's a political will challenge first and foremost, that there would need to be an embrace of this standard of sustainability to guide many development decisions, and then it's a matter of over time having effective, workable legal standards that would achieve that objective.
Very interesting. So I think following on from this important point you made about political will, I guess the next question is, well, what can we all do? As you know, I think there are so many concerned global citizens in today's day and age that really want these things to be achieved, as you said, for all of these voiceless communities and for our own community. What can we do?
Well, I think the best thing we can do, for starters, is not wait for government to get this right. That's certainly not going to get us where we need to be soon enough. So there are many demand reduction strategies that can be employed on an individual basis in the private sector. And those movements have been very successful in addressing many of these challenges of the climate change impacts that are further marginalizing these voiceless communities. So one example would be the fossil fuel divestment movement. Those are examples of individual and institutional decisions about how financial investments are impacting the overall challenge of climate change, and removing support for fossil fuel companies' contributions to those individuals' portfolios or institutional portfolios. And also at a university level institutionally, last year Goldsmiths University of London made a decision to ban the sale of beef in its food outlets on campus. And while that is something that's just a pinprick in the grand scheme of things, if that is an approach that many universities follow suit and do, that's going to have a significant impact on the very carbon intensive production of beef and drive down the demand over time.
Oh, that's very interesting. So I think thinking of it, as you mentioned, that everyone has to be involved. It can come from grassroots levels. We shouldn't just rely on our politicians, so to speak, is I think very empowering.
But I think politics still matter, and on that note, elections are more important than ever in this era. Certainly in the U.S., the 2020 election is the most important in our nation's history, and perhaps in global history when we think about how significant the U.S.'s role in addressing global climate change is. And so the efforts at the legislative level need to perceive and understand the climate change problem not as an environmental problem, but as a social and economic and environmental problem, and implement legislation that understands how significant and far-reaching the climate change challenge is, and actually use law as a way to facilitate that cultural transition, as well as a legal transition that we need to move from fossil fuels to clean and renewable energy, to move from industrial agriculture to plant-based food systems, and ultimately do so in a way that protects the interests of our workforce as well. It's very much of a message that we're all in this together.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Randall.
Thank you so much for having me.